Ladies and gentlemen, there is a quiet transaction happening every day, not in banks, not in courts, but in the unseen chambers of the human heart. No signatures, no witnesses, no alarms. Yet authority is being handed over. The greatest victories of darkness are not won through force, but through permission. Darkness does not always break down the door. More often, it waits patiently for us to leave it unlocked. We imagine authority is taken from us by others, by systems, by people, by circumstances. But more often than not, authority is surrendered piece by piece. Through habits we excuse, thoughts we entertain, and compromises we justify. Darkness rarely announces itself as evil. It comes dressed as comfort, as delay, as distraction, as just this once. It whispers, you don't need to act today. You don't need to speak now. It doesn't really matter. And every time we agree, we shrink. The most dangerous form of darkness is not the one that attacks us openly, but the one that convinces us to abandon our post. Authority is not lost in a single dramatic fall. It erodes through small acts of neglect. When we refuse responsibility, something else gladly accepts it. When we silence conscience, something else speaks louder. When we stop choosing the good does not remain neutral. It retreats. Make no mistake, neutrality is not empty space. It is an invitation. You were not given authority to dominate others, but to govern yourself, to rule your thoughts, your words, your actions. The moment we stop ruling ourselves, something else will. Darkness thrives where clarity fades, where truth is softened, where courage is postponed. But here is the hope: authority can be reclaimed the same way it was lost, through choice, through awareness, through resolve. The moment you say, this thought does not belong here. The moment you say, this habit ends today. The moment you say, I will stand where I have been hiding. Darkness does not argue with authority, it flees from it. So ask yourself honestly and without fear, where have I been passive? Where have I been silent? Where have I mistaken comfort for peace? Because the question is not whether darkness exists. The question is whether it has been given permission. Take back what was always yours. Authority is rarely ripped from our hands in a single violent moment. More often it is quietly placed down step by step, until we forget we were ever holding it. Darkness understands something we often do not. It does not need to overpower a person who is willing to step aside. It only needs patience. It waits for moments when responsibility feels heavy, when obedience feels inconvenient, when vigilance feels exhausting. And in those moments, authority is not stolen, it is surrendered. We like to believe that if something goes wrong in our lives, it must be because an external force acted against us. We blame pressure, people, systems, trauma, or fate. And while these things are real, they are not always decisive. The more uncomfortable truth is that many losses of authority happen internally, long before anything changes on the outside. They begin when we choose avoidance over action, comfort over conviction, silence over truth. Every human being is entrusted with a measure of authority over their thoughts, their words, their responses, their direction. But authority requires maintenance. It demands attention. When we stop governing ourselves, something else inevitably fills the vacuum. There is no such thing as an unclaimed throne in the soul. If we do not sit there deliberately, something else will. The surrender rarely feels dramatic. It often feels reasonable. A person ignores a troubling thought instead of confronting it. A habit is excused because it provides relief. A responsibility is delayed because now is not the right time. Each decision seems harmless in isolation. Yet authority does not disappear all at once, it erodes. And erosion is dangerous precisely because it is slow enough to escape notice. Darkness does not usually say, give me control. It says, you're tired. It does not say, abandon your values. It says, just this once. It does not say, surrender your authority. It says, doesn't really matter. But it does matter, because every time we decline to exercise authority, we train ourselves to be governed rather than to govern. We teach our will to retreat. We teach our conscience to whisper instead of speak. Over time, the inner voice that once said, stand firm, grows quiet, while the voice that says, let it slide, grows confident. What makes this surrender so effective is that it feels voluntary. No one forced the choice. No one threatened us. And because we chose it ourselves, we struggle to recognize it as loss. We tell ourselves we are being flexible, understanding, realistic. But flexibility without boundaries becomes weakness, and realism without courage becomes resignation. There is a profound difference between humility and abdication. Humility acknowledges limits. Abdication refuses responsibility. Darkness thrives when we confuse the two. It persuades us that refusing to act is wisdom, that withholding conviction is kindness, that disengagement is peace. Yet peace that requires the abandonment of truth is not peace at all. It is quiet captivity. Once authority is surrendered, reclaiming it feels difficult, even unnatural. The longer we remain passive, the more resistance we feel toward decisive action. We begin to fear responsibility because we have grown unfamiliar with it. We hesitate not because we are incapable, but because we have practiced hesitation for too long. Yet the truth remains: authority was never taken from us. It was laid down, and what is laid down can be picked back up. The first step is honesty, recognizing where we have stepped aside, where we have allowed fear to dictate choices, where we have permitted habits, moods, or opinions of others to rule what we were meant to govern. This recognition is uncomfortable, but it is not condemning, it is awakening. Darkness loses its grip the moment surrender is named for what it is. When a person says, or I have been passive here, authority begins to return. Not all at once, but truly. Because authority responds to ownership. To stand again does not require perfection. It requires decision. A decision to speak where silence has ruled. A decision to act where delay has dominated. A decision to govern the inner life rather than be governed by it. Darkness cannot rule a person who refuses to abdicate. It has no power over someone who chooses again and again to remain at their post. What appears small is rarely insignificant. Darkness understands proportion better than we do. It knows that a fortress does not fall because of one massive breach, but because of tiny cracks ignored over time. That is why it works patiently, introducing compromise in doses so small they seem harmless. The danger is not in the size of the compromise, but in its direction. A single rationalization rarely alarms us. We tell ourselves it is temporary, understandable, even deserved. We promise we will correct it later when circumstances improve or strength returns. But every compromise subtly reshapes our sense of what is acceptable. What once disturbed us begins to feel normal. What once demanded resistance now receives permission. The conscience does not die suddenly, it is dulled gradually. Small choices are powerful because they train us. Every time we excuse a wrong thought, we practice excusing. Every time we ignore a nudge toward what is right, we practice ignoring. Repetition turns behavior into habit and habit into character. Darkness does not need to rewrite our values, it only needs to lower our standards quietly enough that we do not notice the change. The most deceptive compromises are those that appear practical. We abandon truth to keep the peace. We tolerate dishonesty to avoid conflict. We relax discipline just until things settle down. These choices feel wise in the moment, even compassionate. Yet when principle is repeatedly sacrificed for convenience, convenience eventually becomes the highest authority. Small compromises also distort time. We convince ourselves that today's choice exists in isolation as if it has no connection to tomorrow. But the soul remembers patterns. What we permit today becomes easier tomorrow. What we resist today becomes weaker tomorrow. Momentum is always being built either toward clarity or toward confusion. Darkness rarely asks for loyalty up front. It asks for tolerance. It says, you don't have to approve, just don't oppose. But tolerance without discernment becomes endorsement with delay. When opposition fades, influence grows, and by the time we recognize the weight of what we have allowed, it feels entrenched. One of the most dangerous phrases we tell ourselves is, this doesn't define me. While it may be true that one act does not define a person, repeated acts do shape direction. Identity is not formed by a single decision, but by accumulated ones. The path we walk is determined not by dramatic moments, but by ordinary steps taken consistently. Small compromises also weaken our ability to resist larger ones. Each concession drains moral strength, making the next stand more difficult. We wonder why courage feels scarce when we need it most, forgetting how often we spent it carelessly on lesser surrenders. Strength unused does not remain neutral, it atrophies. What makes this process especially dangerous is its invisibility. No alarms sound when integrity erodes slowly. No one applauds restraint that is never tested. And because the changes are incremental, we adapt without protest. We wake up one day far from where we intended to be, not because we chose the destination, but because we never corrected the course. Yet small choices also hold the power of restoration. The same principle that allows compromise to grow allows obedience to grow as well. A single refusal, though it seems minor, strengthens the will. A small act of honesty, though unnoticed, restores alignment. Faithfulness in small things reawakens authority in larger ones. The turning point comes when we stop dismissing the little things. When we recognize that every thought entertained, every excuse accepted, every truth postponed is shaping the future. Darkness loses ground not through grand gestures alone, but through consistent refusal to compromise. The battle is not always fought on dramatic stages. More often, it is fought in quiet moments where no one is watching and no praise is given. Those moments matter more than we know, because the smallest choices repeated determine who governs the soul. Neutrality is often praised as wisdom, but in matters of moral authority, it is one of the most dangerous illusions we embrace. We tell ourselves that by not choosing sides, we are remaining balanced, reasonable, safe, yet neutrality is never empty space. It is occupied space claimed the moment we refuse to claim it ourselves. When we stand nowhere, something else stands in our place. There are moments when silence feels polite, when inaction feels mature, when restraint feels like peace. But there is a difference between patience and passivity, between restraint and retreat. Darkness flourishes not because it is always aggressive, but because it is rarely opposed. It does not need our allegiance, it only needs our absence. The idea of neutrality comforts us because it removes responsibility. If we do nothing, we cannot be blamed. If we say nothing, we cannot be challenged. If we remain undecided, we do not risk being wrong. But authority was never meant to be safe. It was meant to be exercised. And when we avoid the risk of choosing, we also avoid the power that comes with it. There is no such thing as a neutral heart. Every human being is always moving in some direction, toward truth or away from it, toward light or toward shadow. To pause indefinitely is not to stand still, it is to drift. And drift always follows the strongest current, not the best destination. Darkness understands this principle well. It does not rush people into rebellion. It invites them into delay. It encourages endless consideration, constant qualification, perpetual not yet. It convinces us that there will always be more time to decide, more clarity later, more courage tomorrow. But tomorrow is built from today's choices, and courage delayed is often courage denied. When neutrality becomes a habit, conviction weakens. We grow uncomfortable with strong statements, wary of firm boundaries, suspicious of certainty. Everything becomes complex, relative, open to interpretation. While humility recognizes complexity, neutrality hides behind it. It uses complexity as an excuse to avoid responsibility rather than as a reason to pursue truth more carefully. The cost of neutrality is subtle but severe. When we refuse to name what is wrong, our ability to recognize right becomes blurred. When we refuse to confront falsehood, truth loses its sharpness. Over time, we stop asking what is good and start asking only what is acceptable. And what is acceptable is always defined by the loudest influence present. Neutrality also erodes courage. Courage is strengthened through use, not intention. Each time we avoid standing up, whether in thought, word, or action, we train ourselves to avoid it again. The fear of conflict grows, the fear of rejection deepens, and eventually even the thought of taking a stand feels exhausting. We call this exhaustion peace, but it is not peace, it is surrender dressed in calm language. There is a reason darkness prefers quiet rooms. It thrives where objections are unspoken and lines are not drawn. Where everything is tolerated, nothing is defended. Where nothing is defended, nothing is protected, and what is left unprotected will not remain intact for long. Some believe neutrality keeps them pure, untouched by the struggle between right and wrong. But refusing to engage does not keep the soul clean, it leaves it undefended. A field left unguarded does not remain empty, it grows whatever seeds fall into it. Neutrality does not prevent influence, it guarantees unfiltered influence. The most painful realization often comes later, when we see the consequences of what we did not oppose. We look back and recognize moments where a word could have stopped a pattern, where an action could have redirected a path. Regret does not come from choosing wrongly as often as it comes from not choosing at all. Yet neutrality is not irreversible. The moment a person decides to stand, however late, however quietly, the balance shifts. Taking a position does not require aggression. It requires clarity. It requires saying, even if only inwardly, this matters, or this does not belong, or I will not participate in this. Authority returns the moment neutrality ends. Not because the world suddenly changes, but because the inner posture does. When a person chooses to stand somewhere, darkness loses the luxury of unchallenged space. You do not need to fight everything. But you cannot refuse to stand for anything. Because in the end, what governs the soul is not what we oppose loudly, but what we allow silently. Authority does not begin in public actions or visible power. It begins in the hidden places where no one is watching. Before a person can influence the world around them, they must first govern the world within them. When self-governance weakens, all other forms of authority become fragile. Darkness understands this, which is why it targets the inner life long before it challenges outer behavior. Every thought we allow to remain, every emotion we indulge without examination, every impulse we obey without question is a quiet decision about who is in charge. Self-governance is not about control for its own sake, it is about alignment. It is the deliberate ordering of thoughts, desires, and actions toward what is true and good. When that ordering collapses, chaos does not rush in loudly. It settles in comfortably. Many people assume authority is something granted by position, recognition, or circumstance, but true authority precedes all of that. A person who cannot govern their reactions cannot sustain responsibility. A person who cannot discipline their thoughts cannot protect their values. When the inner life is unmanaged, the outer life becomes reactive, driven by mood, pressure, or impulse rather than principle. Darkness gains influence when the inner world is neglected. It does not need to convince a person to do wrong immediately. It only needs them to stop paying attention. When awareness fades, discipline feels unnecessary. When discipline fades, desire becomes dominant. And when desire rules unchecked, authority has already shifted hands. Self-governance requires effort, and effort is often what we are most tempted to avoid. It is easier to follow feelings than to question them. Easier to indulge impulses than to examine them. Easier to let the mind wander than to direct it. But ease is a poor guide for authority. What feels easy in the moment often becomes costly over time. The mind, if left ungoverned, does not remain neutral. It collects influences, voices, images, narratives without discernment. Over time, these influences shape perception. What once seemed clearly wrong becomes debatable. What once required justification begins to feel natural. This is not sudden corruption, it is gradual accommodation. Authority weakens not because truth disappears, but because attention drifts. Emotional self-governance is equally crucial. Emotions are powerful indicators, but terrible masters. When feelings dictate decisions, consistency disappears. A person who governs themselves only when motivated will soon find themselves governed by circumstances. Darkness exploits emotional volatility, knowing that instability creates openings. Where emotions rule unchallenged, reason retreats. Self-governance does not mean suppressing thoughts or denying feelings. It means evaluating them. It means asking whether a thought deserves space, whether a desire deserves obedience, whether a reaction deserves expression. This internal questioning is not weakness, it is strength. It is the exercise of authority at its most fundamental level. Without self-governance, even good intentions become unreliable. A person may desire what is right but lack the discipline to pursue it consistently. They may recognize truth but lack the resolve to live by it. Over time, the gap between belief and behavior widens, creating inner conflict. Darkness thrives in that conflict, feeding discouragement and self-doubt. When people abandon self-governance, they often replace it with external control. They look for rules, pressure, or approval to guide them. But external control can never fully replace internal authority. When the external pressure is removed, what is not governed internally cannot be sustained externally. Reclaiming self-governance begins with attention. Attention to thoughts as they arise. Attention to habits as they form. Attention to patterns that repeat. Awareness is the first act of authority. The moment a person notices what has been ruling them, the balance begins to shift. Small acts of self-governance matter more than dramatic resolutions. Choosing restraint in a single moment. Redirecting a thought instead of indulging it. Acting according to conviction rather than comfort. These choices strengthen the inner structure that authority depends on. Over time, discipline becomes less forceful and more natural, not because resistance disappears, but because alignment increases. Darkness cannot dominate a well-governed inner life. It may attempt distraction, temptation, or confusion, but it cannot establish control where authority is actively exercised. A person who governs themselves does not need to control others because their strength is not borrowed, it is rooted. True authority is quiet, steady, and resilient. It does not depend on applause or validation. It begins and ends in self-mastery. And when a person reclaims governance of their inner life, they do not merely resist darkness, they outgrow its influence. Darkness rarely advances by force because force creates resistance. Resistance awakens awareness, and awareness restores authority. Instead, darkness prefers something far more subtle and effective: permission. It waits for agreement, however small. It looks for consent, however reluctant. Once permission is granted, resistance is no longer required. Authority has already been invited to step aside. Permission does not always come in the form of desire. Often it comes in the form of tolerance. We may not approve of a thought, a habit, or a behavior, but we allow it to remain. We tell ourselves it is manageable, temporary, or harmless. In doing so, we create space, and where space is created, influence grows. Darkness is patient. It does not rush to dominate. It seeks to normalize. It introduces itself as something familiar, something recurring, something unchallenged. At first, it merely visits. Then it lingers. Eventually, it feels entitled to stay. This progression is only possible because permission was never withdrawn. One of the most dangerous forms of permission is internal agreement. When we stop questioning certain thoughts, when we stop resisting certain impulses, when we stop correcting certain narratives, we tell ourselves we are not being neutral, we are consenting. Silence is not always refusal. In many cases, it is approval without declaration. We often imagine resistance as dramatic confrontation, but most resistance is quiet. It happens when we say no inwardly, when we redirect attention, when we interrupt a familiar pattern. Darkness loses strength not when it is shouted at, but when it is denied space to operate. Where there is no permission, there is no foothold. Darkness also exploits exhaustion. When we are tired, overwhelmed, or discouraged, our boundaries soften. We lower our guard not because we have changed our values, but because maintaining them feels costly. In these moments, permission feels like relief. But relief that comes from surrender always demands repayment later. Another subtle form of permission is justification. We explain why something is allowed to continue because of our past, our stress, our circumstances. These explanations may contain truth, but they also function as agreements. Once we justify a pattern, we stop resisting it, and what we stop resisting begins to rule. It is important to understand that permission does not always feel like choosing darkness. It often feels like choosing peace or rest or survival. But peace built on unchallenged compromise is fragile. It requires continued surrender to maintain. True peace, by contrast, is sustained by authority, not avoidance. Darkness cannot remain where it is actively opposed. It does not argue with authority, it withdraws from it. The problem is not that we lack strength, but that we sometimes fail to exercise it. Authority unused is indistinguishable from authority absent. When permission is withdrawn, influence weakens immediately. A thought that is challenged loses momentum. A habit that is confronted loses inevitability. A pattern that is named loses secrecy. Darkness depends on remaining unnamed and unopposed. Exposure alone disrupts its progress. Withdrawing permission does not require understanding everything or fixing everything at once. It begins with a simple refusal: this no longer belongs here. That statement, whether spoken aloud or held inwardly, reasserts authority. It redraws the boundary. Darkness may attempt to return because it always tests boundaries. But boundaries that are consciously maintained grow stronger with repetition. Each refusal reinforces authority. Each moment of resistance restores clarity. The battle is not about intensity. It is about consistency. Darkness only thrives where permission is ongoing. Remove the permission, and its influence diminishes. Authority does not need to fight endlessly. It only needs to stand firmly. Where permission ends, darkness cannot remain. Authority is not lost forever when it is surrendered, it is only dormant. What has been given away through neglect can be reclaimed through intention. Darkness relies on the belief that once authority is lost, it cannot be recovered. This lie keeps people passive, ashamed, and resigned. But authority responds not to history, but to choice. The moment a person decides differently, the balance begins to shift. Reclaiming authority does not begin with grand declarations or dramatic change. It begins with awareness. Awareness of what has been allowed, what has been avoided, and what has been normalized. This awareness is not meant to condemn. It is meant to clarify. You cannot reclaim what you refuse to acknowledge. Naming the loss is the first act of restoration. Darkness loses power when a person becomes conscious. Much of its influence depends on autopilot, on habits operating without reflection, on patterns repeating without interruption. The moment awareness enters, the process is disrupted. A thought that is noticed can be challenged. A habit that is recognized can be confronted. Awareness restores choice, and choice restores authority. Conscious choice is the turning point. Authority is not reclaimed by feeling strong, but by deciding to act despite weakness. Waiting to feel ready often means waiting forever. Darkness thrives in delay, but even a small, deliberate decision made with clarity reasserts control. Choice breaks inertia. Discipline follows decision. Discipline is not punishment, it is structure. It is the creation of boundaries that protect intention. Without discipline, desire dominates. Without structure, awareness fades. Discipline does not eliminate struggle, but it prevents chaos from ruling. Each disciplined act strengthens the inner framework that authority depends on. Consistency matters more than intensity. A single moment of resolve cannot undo a pattern built over time, but repeated acts of obedience can. Darkness weakens gradually as authority is exercised repeatedly. What once felt overpowering begins to feel manageable. What once felt automatic begins to feel optional. This is not because temptation disappears, but because authority grows familiar again. Clarity must be maintained. Reclaimed authority is not self-sustaining, it requires attention. The same awareness that restored authority must continue to guard it. Drift is always possible, which is why vigilance is necessary, not anxious vigilance, but steady attentiveness. Authority thrives where attention remains active. Reclaiming authority also requires patience with the process. Growth is rarely immediate. Setbacks do not erase progress unless they are accepted as final. Darkness attempts to use failure as proof of futility, but failure only proves where authority needs reinforcement. Persistence, not perfection, is what secures restoration. As authority returns, peace changes character. It is no longer the fragile peace of avoidance, but the solid peace of alignment. This peace does not depend on circumstances being easy, but on the inner life being ordered. It does not require silence, it withstands noise. It does not require surrender, it is sustained by resolve. Authority reclaimed begins to influence more than the self. It shapes speech, presence, and decision-making. Others may not know why, but they sense the difference. Where authority stands, confusion diminishes. Where clarity exists, darkness loses room to operate. The reclaiming of authority is not a one-time event. It is a way of living, a continual choosing of awareness over autopilot, discipline over impulse, truth over comfort. Darkness cannot dominate a life that is consciously chosen. What was surrendered can be restored, not because the past changes, but because the present does. Authority answers the call of those who choose to stand again. As we come to the closing moment, remember this: darkness does not triumph because it is stronger. It triumphs when authority is unattended. Nothing you have heard points to fear, and nothing points to despair. It points to responsibility, and with responsibility comes hope. You are not powerless, you never were. Whatever has crept in did so quietly, by permission, by delay, by distraction, but what entered that way can be removed the same way, through conscious choice and steady resolve. Authority does not return all at once, but it returns the moment you decide to stand where you once stepped aside. Do not wait for perfect conditions. Do not wait for complete certainty. Stand now even if your voice feels unsteady. Stand now even if the step feels small. Darkness does not require you to be extraordinary to retreat. It only requires you to be present. Take responsibility for the inner ground again. Guard what you allow. Choose what you entertain. Govern what you obey. These are not small matters. They are the battlegrounds of the soul. And when you leave this moment, do not ask whether darkness exists. Ask instead whether it has permission. Because where authority is exercised, darkness cannot rule. Stand your ground. Remain at your post. What was always yours still answers to your voice.